If you've seen the Limber Basics video, then you know how to make new limbs and add them into characters. This time we'll be concentrating more on the animation side of things, the how, when, and why to use Limber's 3 different animation modes. When you make a new limb, you can move the controllers around and the knee or elbow moves automatically like a puppet. And that's what we call inverse kinematics, or IK mode. In the Limber pseudo effect on the end controller, you'll find a group of controls specific to inverse kinematics, as well as some for forward kinematics, or FK, and free kinematics, or FreeK. The length properties are in a separate group because they affect limbs on both IK and FK. With Limber, you can animate the length of each section of a limb independently from the other using the upper length and lower length properties. But why would you want that? Well, here's an example. I've already animated this weightlifter on IK, but I want his upper arms to be foreshortened when they're down low, so they don't stick out to the sides looking flat and kind of 2D like this. Where his arms are stretched up in the air, I'll select an end controller and set a keyframe on the upper length property. Then I'll do the same for the other arm. If I hold Shift and select both end controllers, I can then hit U to reveal those keyframes in my timeline, select them, and then come back to where the arms are down low and dial down the upper length properties together. Since these arms are taper limbs, I can play around with the upper rounding property to help the sense of depth with the sleeve. I'll set a keyframe here and then go and do the same thing with the upper rounding property on the other arm. Again, I'll select both layers and hit U to reveal those keyframes, then jump back to the second pose and set the upper rounding properties back to 0 at that point. I'll select and ease all the later keyframes with F9, and now the movement is going to be more natural and there's more of a sense of depth. All limbs are stretchy by default, like this cowboy's legs. If I disable stretch on both of the end controllers, he can jump up in the air and his feet will leave the ground when they should, without me having to do any more keyframing. Another common use for non-stretchy IK limbs is when they need to reach towards a fixed point in space. This zombie's arms were animated on FK, so I'll select an end controller and put them back onto IK by dialing FK blending back down to 0. I'll also disable stretch and then do the same thing for the other limb. When I move the end controllers to a target point over on the right, the arms will aim forwards while still retaining some movement, which gives us a nice stereotypical zombie sleepwalk. You can see that the knee in this animation is jiggling around quite a lot, which is a common problem with walk cycles. Here's an exact duplicate of the same animated limb so that we can see them side by side as I make changes. On the lower copy, I'm going to dial up the anti-pop to 100. Then when I preview, you can instantly see how much smoother the animation is with the anti-pop. To truly visualize the movement of the knees, I'll make locators for them and then set their section properties to joint and use our freebie tool, Arc Checker, to generate arcs for those locators. Without anti-pop, you'll usually need to spend more time fine-tuning the distance between the hips and the ankles in a walk cycle. Stretch, anti-pop, and clockwise are all properties which only affect limbs on IK. They don't have any effect when limbs are on full FK or FreeK mode. All of this character's limbs are currently on IK mode, and this sword and hand layer is parented to an end controller, which doesn't auto-rotate when I move it around. FK mode takes over from IK as I dial up the FK blending property to 100. Instead of being posed by the position of the two controllers, a limb on FK is posed by the upper and lower FK rotation values in the Limber pseudo effect, as well as the rotation of any layers that the start controller is parented to, like this body layer. End controllers don't follow the end of a limb on FK, so to use FK, I need to parent my hand layer to a locator instead. If I set FK blending to 0 before I click the locator button, Limber will automatically reparent any layers that were children of the end controller to the new locator. So now, the hand layer will auto-rotate and stick to the end of the arm when I use FK. Let's animate this arm waving the sword back and forth in a loop. I'll set a keyframe on the end controller's position, go forwards in time and move it to the other pose, and then at the end of the timeline, I'll copy and paste the first keyframe. With both linear spacing and timing, the animation is awful. And even when I ease the keyframes and add arcs to the motion path of the wrist, it's not really got any sense of weight, and it's got a nasty kick. When a limb needs to swing like this, you'll get better movement by animating it on FK. I'll turn up FK blending to 100, but rather than set these FK rotation values manually, I can use Limba's match controls. So I'll check that these drop-downs say match FK to IK, click the match button, and Limba will set an FK pose that perfectly matches the one I've already made on IK. Then I'll set keyframes on the upper and lower FK rotation properties, hit U to reveal them, move over to the second pose, click the match button again, and then do the same thing on the first frame. I'll ease all the keyframes and preview. Already the arcs are much smoother, but watch what happens if I loop the lower FK rotation keyframes and then nudge them forwards by a couple of frames. Suddenly, you can feel a little bit of weight in the sword because the forearm is following through after the upper arm changes direction, giving you overlapping action. The same thing applies with swinging arms in a walk or run cycle like this character. Again, I'll select the lower FK rotation keyframes and nudge them forwards by 2 frames. Then, her hands have more of a feeling of weight as they fling up and kind of hang back slightly. It's always so much easier to do this on FK than it is on IK. In IK mode, a limb will bend in one direction when clockwise is 100% and the other direction when it's negative 100%. When clockwise is 0, the limb shortens itself down to the distance between the two controllers, so it's always dead straight. Limba has a feature that automates the clockwise value called autoflop. When I click the autoflop button, Limba adds an expression to the clockwise property, a new pseudo effect to the end controller, and this gradient overlay to the start controller. With autoflop enabled, clockwise automatically flips from one side to the other as the end controller passes through the gradient zones. You can scrub the fall-off value to make the zones wider or narrower and change the autoflop angle to rotate their axis. The overlay can sometimes get in the way of selecting layers under it, so you can either make the controller smaller with Alt and the size button, or you can disable the overlay with this checkbox. You can remove autoflop altogether by holding Alt and clicking the autoflop button. With or without autoflop, limbs on IK can't change bend direction without shortening, and so there's 2 things you can't animate on IK. You can't animate the lower section moving across the upper section, like this, which we call scissor action, and you can't animate the lower section moving across the line of the upper section like this, which is called breaking the joint. But you can animate these things on FK and FreeK. In the Animator Survival Kit, Richard Williams talks about how to break the joint and lead with the elbow. This baseball pitcher's arm movement is a real fling, so it does both. The elbow starts out behind the wrist, but since it needs to lead the movement upwards, it breaks the limb slightly for the first time here, where you can see the lower FK value goes from negative to positive. Then at the back of the swing, the upper FK rotation changes direction quite abruptly on this keyframe here, and a couple of frames later, the lower FK passes back into the negative, making another break in the joints. At the moment of full extension, there's a slower and more subtle break because the arm is stretched out, and then a very slight series of breaks as it dangles loosely. It's important to check the arcs of your character's elbows and knees, as well as the wrists and ankles. You can do that by adding a locator, setting it to joint location, and then using our freebie tool Arc Checker on those locators. FK will tend to make clean, elegant arcs on both points of the limb. This character needs to pluck the flower from his buttonhole and hold it out to the other side, like the pose in this thumbnail. I'll set keyframes for the end controller's position and clockwise values, move them back in time, and then set the second pose, which I can only do by inverting the clockwise value. But that's going to shorten the limb in the animation, which won't work. What we need is that scissor action, where the lower part of the limb crosses over the upper part. Since we've set poses in IK already, I'll use the match FK to IK function to quickly set the FK rotations. I'll turn on their stopwatches, come over to the other pose, match again, and then turn up FK blending. When I scrub through, the matched FK values have produced this big swing in the lower section, but it's an easy fix. The lower section is rotating the wrong way, so I need to enter -1 in this box here to subtract 360 degrees from the lower FK rotation. Then the scissor action runs the right way. I'll make a new comp and a new limb to show you the basics of FreeK Mode. Unlike FK, you can't just use FreeK by dialing up the free blending property. Instead, you have to assign a FreeK controller to the limb by clicking the FreeK button. That assigns a FreeK controller to the limb at the position of the joint, and it'll set the free blending to 100% for you. So now, as you move the FreeK controller around, the limb ignores its length values completely and stretches to wherever the three controllers are. If I dial down free blending, the limb blends back over to the IK pose, or if I was on FK, it blends over to the FK pose. You can parent FreeK controllers to any other layer except locators on the same limb. To remove FreeK from a limb, just hold Alt or Option and click on the FreeK button. Coming back to this character, if we wanted to make the same movement that we just animated before, but have it lead with the elbow, it would be tricky to do that on FK, but it's easy to do on FreeK. I'll add a FreeK controller to the limb and set a keyframe on its position property at the end pose. When I navigate to the earlier pose and find the elbow sticking out like this, I just need to set the drop-downs to match FreeK to FK and click the match button. Now the movement pretty much matches how it was on FK. I'll add a bit of an arc to the motion path of the FreeK controller, move the later keyframe back a bit in the timeline, and then ease it with F9 so that the movement leads with the elbow, which now arrives before the wrist does. But what about the rest of the animation? It's not looking right, because it was animated on IK and we've since used FK and now FreeK. So I'll dial down the FK blending to 0, since we're not using it anymore, and the same for the FreeK, which gets us back to IK mode. I'll add a keyframe to free blending, set it to hold interpolation, and then when we get to this point, I'll set the free blending up to 100, so that we switch between IK and FreeK on that frame. When we get to the final pose, we could set free blending back down again to 0 to switch back to IK and carry on with the animation in that mode. Previewing the whole thing, it's one seamless narrative action, and you get that scissor action, and it leads with the elbow. Animating the limbs of characters that face forwards is often difficult on IK. Let's say we wanted the weightlifter character to come out of a squat pose before he raises the weights. I'll make the body layer lower on the first pose and also lower the head to help with that sense of lunge. I could animate the legs in exactly the same way that I did the elbows earlier by setting keyframes on the upper length properties and then making them shorter in the first pose. But then the knees bulge out at the start of the move in exactly the same way as the arms do, which makes the whole thing feel a bit automated and mechanical. So instead, let's add FreeK controllers to the legs, set keyframes on their position values, then come over to the other pose and use Limber's Match FreeK to IK button. Instantly, we have much cleaner movement with the knees just coming together a little bit. To help with the sense of depth, I can use the upper rounding property on the legs, just like I did earlier for the arms. With front-facing walk and run cycles, IK really becomes more of a hindrance than a help. But with FreeK, you can concentrate on the animation without feeling like you're fighting your rig. I used this shot from Rocky for reference, and within an hour or so, I could refine the movement and make something more stylized and more interesting. I didn't have an objective in mind, I was just playing about, but using FreeK from reference like this is a great way to work up something that moves with more natural elasticity than the flat puppet rig movement we're used to seeing come out of After Effects. So I hope this video explains not just how to use Limba's 3 different animation modes, but also why you would need them. I'll put a link in the description down below with an After Effects project file that you can download that contains all of the characters that we used here. And hopefully, I'll see you next time.